Cool, all right. Everyone, without further ado, give it up for Nick!
Tenakoto katoa. I'm Nick Parfene, and I'm here to talk to you about a special journey that our application has been on over the last 3 years. And I'm referring to our cultural identity journey. Just over a few years ago, we were only known as Tremi, but something's changed, and now we're also known as Tauhoko. I'm not a sociologist, but they could probably describe the concept of cultural identity a lot better than I can. So I end up taking this paragraph from the most recent social report that the New Zealand Ministry of Social Development has published, because I thought it would be a pretty good conversation starter, and it would kind of place things quite well for us. I have been calling New Zealand home since 2005, and over like 15 years, I didn't really think I'd be speaking in front of native English speakers and talking to them about cultural identity and the importance of language in a native app. But I used to believe that just knowing English would be enough. However, I no longer hold that belief, and I'm going to try and explain why. Leaving modesty aside, Tremi's iOS app has been topping the charts in New Zealand since its launch in 2010. The vast majority of New Zealanders hold at least one account, and they use them to buy things, sell things online, find a job, buy a car, find a house, find a flatmate, a service provider, and so much more. And what this means is that we have a very unique opportunity at Tremi to engage with New Zealanders every single day. How do we engage? Well, language, of course. New Zealand is very lucky to not have one but three official languages: English, Te Reo Maori, and New Zealand Sign Language. I learned today, by the way, that Australia doesn't have an official language, which was quite surprising to me. When we began our journey, the support for English in our app was pretty choice, and we really didn't need any sign language. However, its support for Te Reo was very, very lacking. And that's probably because only 4% or less than 4% of New Zealanders speak the language. And sadly, this number continues to decline. If you look at the studies, even within the Maori population itself, things are not looking great. And nowadays we find ourselves at an all-time low. At least that's what we think. What we have observed, however, is that interest in the language is skyrocketing. Language courses around the country are booking up real fast, and there's a real shortage of professors, of teachers, of instructors. And that's probably because so much of the research and development around how we can better support and nurture Te Reo Maori and the local culture in our daily lives has revolved around television programming. However, I don't know about you, but I find myself interacting mostly with apps and websites on my mobile device rather than sit on a couch and consume government-approved public broadcasting, or as they say, that. What this means is we need to have a rethink. And I have a business hat, so I really struggle to come up with ways to create a business case for building software for less than 4% of our population. The issue is if we don't do it, if we don't create an interface in Te Reo Maori, how can we expect people to actually go and learn the language? So we're stuck in this vicious circle. What I also know as a parent is that I find myself every single day integrating Te Reo Maori in my daily speech, chucking in a word in Maori when I play with my kids. I feel very emotional every time I sing the national anthem, and I get this really great vibe when I watch the All Blacks perform their very friendly and inviting haka. So we were stuck, but we're not anymore. We had to overcome like 3 challenges that I could think of. The first one was that support for Te Reo Maori just isn't available in Xcode. The second one was the language itself was lacking in technical terms. I don't think the Maori who first arrived in New Zealand brought with them words for login and logout on their waka. So it's very, very tricky to come up with ways into localizing the apps in Te Reo Maori. And like I said earlier, it's very, very difficult to produce a business case that stands on its own. So what we did want to do was to respect the user's preferred language. And you may notice that the App Store actually supports the language. We wanted to make sure that our app was a first-class citizen the same way that other apps could be in other languages. And these are my personal heroes. I had the privilege of meeting both Karen and Vivian at WWDC this year, and I'm so glad to tell you that they are actually working at fixing the missing macron over there. So if you go and try to add a new localization in Xcode, you'll see that Maori just isn't amongst the more than 100 languages available. And whilst it might sound scary, it's actually not that hard. All you have to do is open up your PBXproj file, edit the known regions array, and add support for MI and Z, and of course you'll be right. The second challenge was the vocabulary itself, and this is where just having the passion and the drive and the desire to do the right thing is not sufficient. Going to Google Translate and trying to find the right word for shopping cart or whatnot would just end up in a disaster, if not into a very offensive translation. So we were super lucky because we came across this woman. Her name is Karena Kelly, and Karena has a PhD in Maori studies. She's researched the formation and evolution of the language. She's incredibly talented. She knows how to engage with folks, and she's shown us the merit of doing it right. Why we had to pay attention to all the language subtleties and all the fine details that and the importance that those had. So she came in and she worked very closely with us over a period of time. We can actually engage with her on an ongoing basis. So, like I said earlier, the business case is very tricky. We have a small audience, the effort is quite large, and we definitely lack the expertise in-house. So that spells doom. I am super lucky and super humbled and super grateful that the company I work for has created the opportunity for us to do this through its core values. We have 4 values, and the first one is customer aroha. And for the Kiwis in the room, aroha is a fairly common term. It kind of stands for love and care and such other translations. So what we ended up doing was trying to communicate to our teams that the same way we treat accessibility, the same way we must treat the language itself. So what that translated to is that the team that I'm responsible for has now added Tereo Maori support to its definition of done. So if you work in an agile environment and you have like a bunch of steps in your flows, imagine that one of those is making sure that we have captured what needs to be localized. What we don't do is we don't actually stop or pull work from being released until we've done the translation. Instead, we localize in batches and in bursts. So with the 3 roadblocks out of the way, I'd like to show you kind of where we are at, and I also want to introduce you to the team that was behind this effort. So with your permission, I'll play this video.
The Māori language content is important to me. It's been a chance to increase everybody's opportunities to engage with te reo every day.
We've updated over 100 spots within our iOS app. So now you can do things like register an account or even navigate the app. And it's all in te reo, which is pretty awesome.
Our team of designers and developers have gone the extra mile on this project. This was a project of passion, and they care at a very deep level about their impact. Support for Tereo Maori is something that we plan on continuing doing. We have embedded Tereo in our processes to ensure it's part of our thinking when we build anything and everything into our apps.
It's not just a historical element. Te reo Māori is tied to the future as well. It's an interesting moment in history, I think, where we start to think about how we might better understand ourselves as New Zealanders as well through the medium of te reo.
Thank you, that was Karena. When we released the first batch, we were absolutely humbled by the feedback. I remember seeing people in the office high-fiving, celebrating, being super excited and super stoked that we actually got something like that past the finish line. One of the people that indirectly reports to me actually confessed that this was the most meaningful project he has worked on in his entire career. And it's also like customer feedback like that told us that we were doing the right thing. When we introduced the language, or when we introduced support for Tereo Maori to our app, we had to make a decision whether we did a one-off thing, a marketing stint, or whether we were going to embark on a long-term journey. And we chose the latter. We've made a long-term commitment with all those who choose to learn or speak the language. And we were not just after a publicity stunt. So because of that, we had to be very careful how we approached the implementation. given the very small number of folks who actually understand the language, just translating the whole app into Te Reo Maori would have been very overwhelming. Even if we did convince people to go into their system settings and set Te Reo Maori as a language, it would have been a very short-lived experience. So we had to be super careful with how we approached it. And that approach was a very gradual one. We started with the brand, navigation, and we're gently adding support for more. The next steps include something that should have shipped today. I'm not sure, I haven't checked the App Store. We have an in-app switch that allows us to override the system settings. So we want to give people a sense of safety so they can roll back quite easily. We're also looking into ways of introducing gestural support and other UI interactions that allow people to change on the fly and learn. We want to turn the app from an English-only app into an educational tool until people kind of develop some sort of confidence to try it in Te Reo. And lastly, we will be looking at introducing support for Te Reo Maori content into the app. The dream for us is to convince as many folks as possible to go through this kind of flow and go into their system settings and select Te Reo Maori as their preferred language. iOS is incredible because it falls back very gently and naturally from one language to another until it finds a correct match or a match that an app can actually respect. So in our case, because we have support for Te Reo Maori, our application will present itself in Te Reo Maori. But if your application doesn't have support for Maori, English will be the next one. So if we manage to convince as many people to do this, then we will have succeeded. What we also think will happen is that other application developers around New Zealand will start seeing user agents and whatnot in their logs, where more and more folks have chosen MI_NZ as their preferred locale. And I know the numbers from Stats New Zealand are bullshit because I see the numbers in our GA. So when we first shipped the app, they were like really low. We've gone through a couple of blog posts and some more here and there, and now we've more than doubled year on year the number of Te Reo Maori speakers that engage in Te Reo. So once you see those MI&Z user agents, hopefully the business cases will become simpler, even if you don't have a customer or have value like we do. We care about Android as well. And unfortunately, there is no Maori support for most of the Android phones out there. Last I looked into it, there was a single device, a Huawei device, that, to the best of my knowledge, only 20 New Zealanders had bought. There was not sufficient. I know it's very difficult, it's very different, but we did not give up. So one of our team members actually embarked on his own personal vendetta, and he started adding support for Te Reo Maori to our Android app. That's for a different time and quite possibly a different conference. So I want to leave you with some takeaways. The most important one, I think, based on what I've seen so far, is that you shouldn't be making promises you can't keep. I've been very privileged to work with several organizations in New Zealand, whether they're banks, app developers, game developers, who wanted to do the same thing as us. And time again, I hear the story around, Maori Language Week is in September. It's actually next week. And we want to make a good impression with our speakers. But that is a promise. That is misleading customers. That's kind of saying, hey, we care when we really don't. We just want to kind of tick a box and get an article in a newspaper. And that is just misleading, and it shouldn't be what you do. I also think you should work with a specialist. As you can tell, we've learned a lot from engaging with Karena, and it was by far the best decision we made. We had basically zero backlash from native speakers. People were impressed, whether they were native speakers or not. They were absolutely impressed with how we managed to translate things in a way they could understand, despite the fact that the language lacked the terminology. And lastly, I think you should consider, if you decide to do it, to ensure longevity for this work, try and integrate into your processes. Find a way where this fits, whether it's a quarterly review, whether it's your definition of done, whatever it might be. But only if you actually actively add support for the language to your flows and processes will you actually have any success, I think. We did start 3 years ago, but we feel like we've only just begun. So I'm super grateful to all the organizations out there that have joined us on this journey. And if you relate in any way, shape, or form to our story, I hope that these kinds of ideas will help you or will motivate you to do the right thing for all your customers. Try and think about everyone who speaks your language. I said earlier I didn't think Australia had an official language, and if Wikipedia is right, it turns out only 73% of the population, less than in Australia, actually speaks English at home. So I don't know if it's a big or a small assumption, but if I lived in Australia, I would definitely look into ways to make my applications accessible to everyone. Thank you very much. And if there is time, if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. That was amazing. We've got a couple of minutes, so does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I quite caught it. Did you need to wait for Apple to install Maori on the device before you could put it in your app?
So the question was if we had to wait for Apple to add support for Maori before we add it to our app. Short answer, no. Tereo Maori was actually available on iOS. Funny story, there's support for Rarotonga Maori and Maori in New Zealand. So that was available before we started. What was different or what's difficult is that Xcode itself did not support Tereo Maori. So initially, I remember I had to hack a plist file. You can tell that I'm an imposter. This is not what Kiwi English sounds like. I'm actually Romanian. So I added support for Romanian to our project. And then I went and I found every reference for RO, and I swapped it with MI and Z, and the app just started working. So, so nowadays it's simpler. Nowadays you have the known regions array in your PBX project file, so you can just go and add whatever language you like. But back 3 years ago, that wasn't possible. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. How many languages do you currently support in your app?
The question was how many languages we support in the app. We only support the official languages, so we support English and Maori, and even our app doesn't have full support for Maori, so we are gradually introducing more and more support. By the way, I've been saying Tereo Maori. Tereo means our language in Maori. Maori is the name that you should use when referring to the language when you speak English, and Tereo when you speak Tereo Maori. But yes, we only support 2 languages.
Okay. When you happen to add any new line, any new phrase, how do you verify that it translated into both languages?
So the question was, how do we verify that when we add a new concept or a new entry into our app, it's translated to both languages? So we use localizable.strings file. So when we create a new entry, we add it to that strings file, and then we make sure that there is a counterpart translation. But the flow actually relies on us describing the interaction from a user's perspective, and then we produce an English version of that, like a mock. We hand that over to Karina and her team, and then they produce a Maori translation. We get that response back, and then we oftentimes verify that with either a Maori language commission or some other Maori speaker. So the flow is actually quite convoluted, if you like. That's why we work in bursts.
It sounds like it involves a lot of manual jobs, so it's not automated any.
No, we do not automate any of it. No. You're welcome.
Do you support Tereo in the listings as well? Like, does your server able to handle like macarons and stuff like that?
So the question is if we support Tereo Maori in the API in the listing process when we create entries to the website. Short answer, no. That's the 3rd bullet point, what we plan on doing. So talk aside, I actually don't believe in a bicultural New Zealand. I believe in a multicultural New Zealand. So we are starting with Tereo and with English and Tereo, and then hopefully we'll open up the floodgates for everything. We have certain APIs that support Maori, such as your account bio and profile information and whatnot. But the API itself does not currently allow for that to happen. We're working towards that, but that's going to come a bit later on. It's part of the journey. We're also planning on displaying the UI in the language that kind of matches between the 2 users. So if you as a user speaks, say, Tereo and English, and somebody else speaks Tereo and, I don't know, Mandarin, we'll match you on Tereo. Sorry? So the question was, when did the journey start and how long did it take, and like a life cycle? I think there was an emotional journey, and that for me started soon after I realized that New Zealand was going to be my home. So when I moved there, I chose to become assimilated, and for that I had to embrace the local culture. When I learned the national anthem, it begins with Tereo Maori. I couldn't bear the idea of singing an anthem that I didn't understand. It's actually much nicer than the English translation for another time. But this journey for Trame itself, I think, is very hard to pinpoint a certain time. I think it was the right types of people kind of coming together at the right time. We have like Atlassian in Sydney, we have a one-day hackathon, FedEx Day, Ship It Day, whatever it's called. And this was one of the things we were trying to do to see how well it would work. And then that was just the beginning of the whole agitation. And then, to be fair, we had to use a lot of the clout that some of us had around the business to convince a DBA to do some stuff for us, to convince a public relations team to do some stuff. And once we did it, then it became a company-wide effort. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there anything else? Oh, just one more.
I guess, like, further than localization, were there any other kinds of things you did differently based on the kind of cultural differences, or was there any kind of other aspects of the app that you changed or did differently?
Yeah. So the question is, did we change anything else based on the localization or the? Yes, actually there were. The fun detail. The language itself, and I don't speak it properly, but I understand some of it, is very descriptive, it's very lyric. So to give you an idea, the word for log out is e puta. However, when you translate, you have to go to the place of logout and do the action of logout. So we had to change our empty state messages and our descriptors for the accessibility labels and stuff like that, because otherwise you'd be saying to a visually impaired user, tapping this button will do the thing, rather than tapping this button will take you to the place of doing the thing. So I know it sounds like a double whammy because you have the accessibility and then localization, but yes, it did change. It forces you to think about a customer's journey and interaction, and you have to kind of remove yourself from the, hey, I'm reading it, it's natural to me, therefore this is how it must be for everyone else. So yes, there were some very subtle differences.
All right, that's all the time we have. Thank you again,
Thank
Nick.
you.
That was enlightening. Everyone give it up for Nick.
Thank you.